At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, 18-year-old Franz peered through the narrow firing slit of a bunker known as WN62 and watched something impossible happen. The sea disappeared. Not beneath clouds. Not beneath smoke. It vanished beneath nearly 7,000 Allied ships. In that moment, Franz was about to face the largest invasion in human history with no armored support, no air cover, and no orders that would arrive in time. For the men defending the Atlantic Wall, the longest day in history had already begun. By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany had poured millions of cubic yards of concrete into the Atlantic Wall, a massive chain of bunkers, gun positions, and defenses stretching more than 1,700 miles from Norway to France. To German propaganda, it was an unbreakable fortress. To the soldiers living inside its cold, damp bunkers overlooking Normandy, it often felt more like a grave waiting to be sealed. The defenses were impressive, but far from perfect. Some areas were heavily fortified with artillery and overlapping fields of fire. Others were thinly defended by exhausted soldiers and little more than hope. And the men standing guard were not the unstoppable warriors often imagined in history books. Many were older reservists. Some were wounded veterans. Others were teenagers barely old enough to shave. Franz was only 18 years old, hundreds of miles from home, cleaning a rifle he prayed he would never have to use. Alongside him were members of the Ostbataillon, Soviet conscripts forced into German uniforms to defend a coastline for a cause that was never truly theirs. Life inside the bunkers moved slowly. The soldiers played cards beneath dim lights. They wrote letters home. They waited. And they worried. Most understood one harsh truth. Being stationed in Normandy instead of the Eastern Front wasn't safety. It was only temporary luck. The waiting itself became a battle. Rumors of invasion spread through the trenches. Every distant engine sound carried meaning. Every unusual radio transmission raised questions. Some men slept fully dressed, ready for an alarm that could come at any moment. Others sat silently beside ammunition crates, smoking cigarettes and staring into the darkness. Then came the night of June 5th. The calm of the Norman coast was shattered by a strange, distant roar rising from the sea and sky. Thousands of Allied aircraft crossed the English Channel overhead. Soldiers emerged from bunkers and looked upward. No one needed confirmation anymore. The invasion had begun. Yet while the defenders watched the sky with growing fear, the German High Command struggled to react. Field Marshal Rommel was in Germany visiting his wife. Hitler was asleep in Berlin. Officers hesitated to wake him. Across the Atlantic Wall, isolated garrisons waited for orders that never came. Then dawn arrived. As the morning fog slowly lifted, the horizon transformed into something beyond imagination. The sea disappeared. In its place stood an enormous armada of Allied ships. Battleships, destroyers, transports, landing craft. Thousands upon thousands of vessels moving together through the grey morning light. For Franz and the defenders at WN62 overlooking Omaha Beach, the first emotion was not panic. It was disbelief. The scale was almost impossible to understand. The horizon itself seemed alive. A moving wall of steel stretching farther than the eye could see. One German defender later recalled. The horizon was nothing but ships. Then, at 5:23 a.m., the warships opened fire. The naval bombardment shook the coastline with terrifying force. Massive shells slammed into cliffs and bunkers. Concrete trembled. Dust filled the air. Lights shattered. Telephone lines were cut almost instantly. Inside the bunkers, men could barely hear one another. They felt the explosions through the ground beneath their feet. For many defenders, the bombardment became a nightmare of darkness, noise, smoke, and fear. Some believed the bunkers were collapsing around them. Others simply waited, convinced the next explosion would bury them alive. Then the shelling shifted inland, and through the smoke, the landing craft appeared. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the first American assault waves reached Omaha Beach. The German defenders had prepared range cards for every section of sand below. Machine guns opened fire. Mortars exploded across the shoreline. At WN62, machine gunner Heinrich Severloh fired continuously into the advancing troops. He would later claim he fired thousands of rounds during the battle. Below the bluffs, the scene was horrific. Men drowned beneath heavy equipment. Landing craft burned in shallow water. Bodies became tangled among steel obstacles. Medics crawled through blood-stained surf trying to save the wounded. Inside the bunkers, men could barely hear one another. They felt the explosions through the ground beneath their feet. For many defenders, the bombardment became a nightmare of darkness, noise, smoke, and fear. Some believed the bunkers were collapsing around them. Others simply waited, convinced the next explosion would bury them alive. Then the shelling shifted inland, and through the smoke, the landing craft appeared. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the first American assault waves reached Omaha Beach. The German defenders had prepared range cards for every section of sand below. Machine guns opened fire. Mortars exploded across the shoreline. At WN-62, machine gunner Heinrich Severloh fired continuously into the advancing troops. He would later claim he fired thousands of rounds during the battle. Below the bluffs, the scene was horrific. Men drowned beneath heavy equipment. Landing craft burned in shallow water. Bodies became tangled among steel obstacles. Medics crawled through blood-stained surf trying to save the wounded. Inside the bunkers, training took over. The defenders loaded ammunition, changed barrels, adjusted sights, and kept firing. Yet despite the devastating casualties, the invasion never stopped. More landing craft arrived. More troops came ashore. Destroyers moved dangerously close to the beach, firing directly into German strongpoints. Allied tanks fought their way through the surf and blasted bunker positions at close range. The defenders slowly realized a terrible truth. No reinforcements were coming. No tanks. No air support. No rescue. They were isolated pockets of infantry trying to hold back the combined industrial power of the Allied world. By midday, the situation began to collapse. American troops were climbing the bluffs. They cut through barbed wire, entered trenches, attacked bunker positions from behind. The fighting became desperate and chaotic. Grenades rolled through bunker corridors. Flamethrowers forced soldiers from fortified rooms. Wounded men hid in storage chambers clutching empty rifles while explosions shook the walls around them. Many already understood that the war had been turning against Germany long before D-Day. Now they were simply witnessing the moment the Atlantic Wall finally broke. By the end of June 6th, Omaha Beach had been secured at a terrible cost. Thousands of American soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. German losses were also severe. For Franz and the surviving defenders, retreat became the only option. They marched eastward beneath relentless Allied aircraft and artillery fire. Passing shattered bunkers and burning gun positions, they left behind the remains of what had once been called an impenetrable fortress. Many carried a painful contradiction. They had fought with fear, discipline, and instinct for a regime that had brought catastrophe to Europe. They had defended a wall that history would not allow to stand. Today, many of those bunkers still remain along the Normandy coastline, weathered by rain, wind, and salt. Silent reminders of one of history's most important days. Nearby, at the German military cemetery of La Cam, more than 21,000 German soldiers rest beneath dark crosses and oak trees. The grass above them does not care what uniform they wore. History remembers victory and defeat, but it also remembers suffering. June 6, 1944 remains frozen in memory as a grey morning without end. A day when young men inside concrete bunkers watched the sea disappear beneath steel and fire. And perhaps that is the true ghost of D-Day. Not victory, not defeat, but the enormous human burden carried by ordinary people trapped inside events far greater than themselves. History does not only write victory and defeat, it writes the moments where man becomes nothing more than a witness to the decisions of time. Thank you so much for watching.